In this step, we would want to look at the various starter projects which are present in Spring Boot. In the last step, we looked at we looked at Spring Boot Starter Test, we looked at Spring Boot Starter Web, and we looked at Spring Boot Starter JPA. We look at other starters which are present in this specific step. This will be a short step, but it would be great for you to understand the different starters that are offered by Spring Boot. One of the important starters that is offered by Spring Boot is Spring Boot Starter Web Services. This is the starter you would need to use when you want to develop SOAP web services. If you understand web services, then there are basically REST services and SOAP services. Actually, the classification is not as simple as that, because SOAP web services also can fit into the bracket of REST web services. So if you want to define WSDL and then implement your web service, that's a SOAP web service, right? So if you are developing a SOAP web service, then you can use the starter, Spring Boot Starter Web Service. We already looked at using a RESTful application. What did we use to build? We use Spring Boot Starter Web. Similar to that, even if you want to develop a typical web application, you can use Spring Boot Starter Web. Spring Boot Starter Test, as we looked at in the previous example, is for unit testing and integration testing. Spring Boot Starter Test really makes it easy to write great unit tests and integration tests. If you want to write applications using Spring JDBC, then Spring Boot Starter JDBC is perfect for you. If you're writing RESTful web services and you would want to add HateOS features, HateOS, whichever you'd want to call it. If you want to add those features to your services, then Spring Boot Starter HateOS is the one to go for. All web applications and all RESTful services should be secured. Spring Boot Starter Security is the starter for using Spring Security. You can implement both authentication and authorization, and Spring Boot Starter Security has support for basic authentication as well as OAuth authentication. It also has support for OAuth 2 authentication as well. So whichever one you are using, you can use Spring Boot Starter Security. As we looked at in the previous step, Spring Boot Starter JPA is the option when you want to do JPA. By default, Spring Boot Data JPA uses Hibernate as the ORM framework. If you want to implement caching, then you can go for Spring Boot Starter Cache. It has support for wide range of caching options, including distributed caches like Hazelcast. If you are using Spring Boot Starter Data JPA and you would want to expose your entities as RESTful services, then you can go with Spring Boot Starter Data REST. Spring Boot Starter Data REST makes it very easy to expose Spring Boot Data JPA Spring Boot Data JPA entities as RESTful web services. They expose all the typical request methods like get, post, put, and delete. The other starters of Spring Boot are more technical. Spring Boot Starter Actuator, which we'll use it in one of the next steps, is for monitoring, and also you have starters for the embedded servers. We saw that by default we were using Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. So you can also use Spring Boot Starter Undertow or Jetty if you want to use those embedded servlet containers. And also there are starters for logging and Log4j. Spring Boot actually provides a wide variety of starters. Actually going through all of them and understanding them would be taking an effort of a lifetime, I think. Okay, there you go. The idea behind this step was to wide variety of starters that Spring Boot provides. Whenever you have a problem to solve, go ahead and look at if there is a starter to solve your problem. Until the next step, bye-bye.